The dress fell to the floor before Renata could even catch it. She was kneeling in the hallway on the second floor of the mansion, gathering the clothes she had dropped from the laundry basket, when she heard his voice coming from the staircase. Loud. Impatient. The kind of voice that doesn't wait for an answer, only obedience. "Did someone clean my office today?" Renata lifted her head. Teodoro Villanueva was standing at the top of the stairs, tie loosened, briefcase in hand, looking at her as if he were looking at an obstacle in his way. In his 40s, hair streaked with gray at the temples, the tired face of someone who had carried the world alone for far too long. She answered yes. He didn't say thank you. He walked past her and entered the office without another word. Renata stayed there, kneeling, holding a wrinkled dress shirt in her hands, and felt that familiar tightness in her chest. It wasn't humiliation. It was something older, deeper. It was the weight carried by someone who learned they take up too much space in the world without deserving to. She was 36 years old. For the past 8 months, she had worked in that house as a maid. Before that, she had a different life. Not rich, but dignified. She taught Portuguese at a public school in the countryside. She had a small classroom full of books, students who called her by name with affection, and a younger brother she had raised alone since their mother left. It was because of her brother that everything collapsed. She didn't like to remember. But sometimes the memory came without warning. The night at the hospital, the debt, the wrong decision she made believing it was the only way out, the dismissal, the lawsuit, the shame that swept away everything she had built. In less than a year, Renata went from being a respected teacher to an invisible woman scrubbing the floors of other people's homes. The Villanueva mansion was located in a gated neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. 5 bedrooms, a huge garden, a swimming pool no one used, and a heavy silence that Renata had learned to recognize as grief. Teodoro had lost his wife 3 years earlier, and he had lost parts of himself along with her. His daughter, Valentina, was 14 years old and had the look of someone who had given up on smiling. She spent her days in her room with headphones on, answered questions with monosyllables, and looked at her father with a mixture of love and resentment that only children of absent parents know. Renata observed all of this in silence. She was good at that, observing without being seen. But there was one thing she couldn't understand. Every week, on Thursday nights, Teodoro would stand for long minutes in front of the bedroom that remained locked at the end of the hallway. He never went in. He just stood there with his hand pressed against the wood, as if listening to something on the other side. And then he would turn around and go to sleep without speaking to anyone. Renata never asked what was inside that room. It wasn't her place to ask. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that everything began to change. Valentina had a breakdown at school. The coordinator called saying the girl refused to enter the classroom and sat in the hallway for 2 hours without speaking to anyone. Teodoro was in a meeting in another state. His secretary called the house asking someone to pick the girl up. Renata went. She found Valentina exactly as they described, sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, headphones hanging around her neck, eyes red. Not from crying. From contained anger. Renata sat down on the hallway floor beside her. She didn't say anything for a while. She just stayed there. "Aren't you going to ask me what happened?" Valentina said, in the tone of someone expecting judgment. "No," Renata answered. "But if you want to tell me, I'll listen." Valentina looked at her suspiciously. And then very slowly, she began to speak. Renata listened to everything. Without interrupting. Without giving advice that wasn't asked for. She simply listened. On the way back, Valentina said something Renata didn't expect. "You're the first person who didn't try to fix me." Renata didn't answer. But she felt something move inside her. Something that had remained still for far too long. When they arrived at the mansion, Teodoro was already there. He had returned earlier than expected. He was standing at the entrance, still wearing his suit jacket, waiting. When he saw the two of them arriving together, with Valentina slightly less closed off than when she had left, he looked at Renata in a way she had never been looked at in that house before. As if, for the first time, he had truly seen her. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments what you thought, and which city or country you're watching from. Teodoro didn't say anything that day. But the next morning, when Renata arrived in the kitchen at 6:30 to prepare breakfast, he was already sitting at the table with an empty cup in front of him, staring out at the garden window like someone who hadn't slept properly. She greeted him with a quiet good morning and went to light the stove without making noise. "How did you do that?" he asked suddenly. Renata stopped. Slowly turned around. "Excuse me?" With Valentina. He was still looking at the window. "She came home different yesterday. I can't explain it. But she was different." Renata thought for a second before answering. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just stayed quietly beside her." Teodoro finally looked at her. And there was something in that look she couldn't classify at the moment. It wasn't exactly gratitude, it was more like astonishment. As if her answer was too simple to be true, but at the same time the most honest thing he had heard in a very long time. He didn't continue the subject. He picked up the cup, waited for the coffee to be ready, and went to the office like every other day. Renata stayed in the kitchen, her heart beating a little faster than it should. It was that same week that Dorinha arrived. Dorinda Castelao wasn't exactly a visitor. She was Teodoro's sister-in-law, sister of his late wife, and behaved inside that house with the authority of someone who believed she had rights over everything her sister had left behind. She arrived on a Friday with 2 large suitcases and the tight smile of someone who smiles without using their eyes. "I came to spend a few days with my favorite niece," she said to Teodoro, referring to Valentina as if the girl were an inherited object. Teodoro accepted without arguing. It was obvious he didn't have the energy for that kind of conflict. Dorinha noticed Renata the moment she walked through the door. She looked her up and down with that quick assessment some people make when they want to make it clear where you stand in the hierarchy. "Are you new here?" she asked, without waiting for an introduction. "I've been here 8 months, ma'am." 8 months. Dorinha repeated the number as if it were little. "So you're still learning how things work in this house." It wasn't a question. In the following days, Dorinha built her territory with calculated moves. She reorganized the kitchen routine without informing anyone, started giving direct orders to Renata in a tone that dismissed any kindness, and found faults in everything: a poorly cleaned window, a badly ironed shirt, a lunch hour she considered inappropriate. Renata endured it in silence. She had learned that silence was survival. But there was something more disturbing than the orders. It was the way Dorinha approached Valentina, with an artificial sweetness the girl clearly rejected, but that the father couldn't see. Dorinha said she was there to help raise her niece. In practice, she spent her days trying to convince Valentina that she needed more discipline, less freedom, and that the right path was the boarding school her sister had chosen before dying. "Your mother would have wanted this for you," Dorinha said one afternoon in the living room, thinking no one could hear. Renata was in the hallway. She stopped unintentionally. "My mother isn't here to want anything," Valentina replied, with a coldness painful to hear. The silence that followed was too heavy for both sides. Renata slowly resumed walking, with that tightness in her chest again. Not for herself this time. What disturbed her was something else too, something she had started noticing in the past few days. Every time Dorinha was around and Teodoro arrived home, she changed completely. The hardened tone turned into honey, her posture shifted, she laughed at things that weren't funny, and found ways to stay close to him in a manner that seemed rehearsed. Renata wasn't naive. She understood what she was seeing. And she also understood that Dorinha had noticed something, perhaps the way Teodoro had looked at her that morning in the kitchen, because from that point on the orders became harsher, the criticism more frequent, and one Wednesday afternoon Dorinha called her into a corner of the hallway and said in a low, precise voice, "A good maid is one who knows her place. You know yours, don't you?" Renata stared at her for 3 full seconds before answering. "Yes, ma'am, I do." But while saying it, for the first time in a long while, she felt something that wasn't fear. It was different. Firmer. Warmer. It was the beginning of something she still didn't have a name for. It was Valentina who opened the door. Not the door to the locked bedroom at the end of the hallway. That one remained closed, guarding whatever it guarded. It was another door. The one Renata had kept closed inside herself for years, locked with guilt and shame, convinced that whatever was on the other side no longer deserved light. It happened on a night of heavy rain, the kind that makes the entire house feel quiet in a different way. Valentina had come down to the kitchen after midnight, thinking everyone was asleep. She found Renata sitting at the table with an old book in front of her and a cup of tea that had already gone cold. The girl looked at the book before looking at her. "Drummond?" she asked, surprised. Renata looked at the worn cover as if she had forgotten what she was reading. She made that involuntary gesture of someone about to hide something, and then stopped. She left the book on the table. You know him? The teacher assigned one of his poems last year. Valentina pulled out the chair beside her and sat down without being invited. I hated it at the time. I thought it was impossible to understand. And now? I don't know. The girl looked at the open page. Now I think maybe I just hadn't lived enough to understand it. Renata stayed silent for a moment. There was something about that sentence, spoken by a 14-year-old girl at 11 at night in a dark kitchen, that was too mature and too sad at the same time. You used to teach, right? Valentina asked suddenly. Renata hadn't expected the question. She felt her stomach tighten. How do you know that? I accidentally saw a paper in your bag once. An old certificate. It was torn at the edge. Renata didn't answer immediately. She looked at the cup of cold tea, at the rain hitting the window, at the book open to the poem she had read so many times she knew it by heart. And then very slowly she told her. Not everything. But enough, that she had been a teacher, that she had loved it, that she had lost it because of a wrong choice made for the right reason, and that since then she had kept everything inside a box she pretended didn't exist. Valentina listened without interrupting. Exactly the same way Renata had done in the school hallway weeks before. When she finished, the girl simply said, You still know everything you knew before? Knowledge doesn't disappear, Renata replied, almost without thinking. Then you're still a teacher. You just don't have a classroom right now. Renata looked at her. There was such a simple and direct logic in that statement that it hurt in a strange way, the kind of pain that appears when someone names something you had decided never to name again. That night, Valentina asked her to explain the poem. Renata explained it. Slowly, carefully, the way she had always taught, not dumping information, but asking questions, creating space for the girl to arrive at the answers on her own. And Valentina did. With the bright eyes of someone who had just understood something she never expected to understand. They stayed up until 1 in the morning talking about poetry, language, and what words hide when they seem to mean something else. When Valentina finally went upstairs to sleep, she stopped at the kitchen doorway and turned around. Can I ask you something? You can. Don't stop being what you are. Renata remained alone in the kitchen for a while after that. With the book in her hand, the rain outside, and something rearranging itself inside her, silently, the way things that truly matter always do. In the days that followed, those late-night conversations became routine. Valentina started leaving books on the kitchen table as if forgetting them by accident. Renata began replying with little notes inside the pages, observations, questions, a sentence here and another there. It was a language the two of them had created without ever planning it. Teodoro noticed the change in his daughter before understanding where it came from. Valentina had started appearing at dinner more often, had answered with more than monosyllables on 1 or 2 occasions, and one night he found her in her room not with headphones on but with an open book in her hands. He didn't say anything. But that same night, walking through the hallway, he found Renata leaving the laundry room with a stack of folded clothes. What have you been doing with her? He asked. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was the tone of someone who wants to understand. Renata thought about giving a short answer, but there was something in the way he asked, without his usual haste, without the distance he always kept, that made her answer honestly. I'm only listening to what she already knew how to say. Teodoro stood still in the hallway for a second longer than necessary. And then he did something Renata didn't expect. He asked if she had time for coffee. The coffee turned into conversation. The conversation turned into hours. Teodoro apologized right at the beginning, for the cold tone of the first months, for the distance, for the way he had treated her presence in the house as something functional and nothing more. Renata listened without minimizing it and without dramatizing it. She said she understood. And she truly did. She knew the kind of pain that closes a person off inside themselves without them even realizing it. They stayed on the back porch until almost midnight. The night was cold enough that both of them kept their hands wrapped around their cups. Teodoro spoke about his wife for the first time since Renata had arrived at that house. Not with the reverence of someone preserving an altar, but with the real sadness of someone who loved, lost, and still didn't quite know how to keep going. This time, Renata shared more about her past. Her brother. The school. The choice. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't judge her. And when she finished, he simply said, You made a mistake out of love. That doesn't define you. She didn't answer. But those 6 words did something that 8 months of silence had not managed to do. They cracked a wall she had built very carefully, brick by brick, since the day everything had fallen apart. In the weeks that followed, something began to change in the house. Not dramatically, organically, almost imperceptibly, like the temperature rising 1 degree at a time before you realize you're warm. Teodoro started looking for Renata with small excuses. A question about dinner that didn't need to be asked in person. A comment about the garden that could have waited. An extra cup of coffee prepared without anyone asking for it. Dorinya saw everything. And it was exactly at that point that she decided to act. On a Monday morning, while Teodoro was out of the house in a meeting, Dorinya called Renata into the main living room with that smile that never reached her eyes. On the coffee table was an envelope. "I found this yesterday while organizing the guest room," Dorinya said, pushing the envelope toward Renata. "I thought you might want to explain it before I show it to Teodoro." Renata looked at the envelope. She recognized it. It was a copy of the lawsuit she had faced years earlier, the document recording the accusation of embezzlement from the school where she had worked. Someone had found it, printed it, and placed it there with surgical intent. "Where did you find this?" Renata asked, her voice steady. "I already told you. In the guest room." It was a lie. Renata knew it was a lie because the only place that document existed was inside a folder at the bottom of her backpack, which stayed in the closet of her room. Not in the guest room. In her room. She felt the anger rise slowly, controlled, like water heating before it boils. "What do you want?" she asked directly. Dorinya dropped the smile. She became more herself, colder, more precise. "I want you to pack your things and leave this house before Teodoro comes back. Quietly and voluntarily. No drama, no explanation. You disappear, and this document disappears with you." Renata stayed silent for a long moment. And then the first thing happened that Dorinya had not calculated. Valentina was standing on the staircase. She had come down without making a sound and was standing on the last step, her face closed off, listening to everything from the beginning. When Dorinya saw her, there was a second of hesitation, the first since she had arrived at that house. "Valentina, sweetheart, this is a conversation for adults." "I'm 14 years old," the girl said, coming down the last step. "And I heard every word." She pulled her phone from her pocket. With calm movements, she opened the messaging app and showed the screen to Renata. There was a conversation with her father, started 3 minutes earlier, while Valentina was still on the staircase listening. She had written everything in real time. And Teodoro had replied with 2 words, "I'm coming." Dorinya looked at the phone. Looked at Valentina. Looked at Renata. And for the first time since she had arrived, she had no prepared answer. Teodoro arrived 20 minutes later. He read the conversation on the phone before walking through the door. When he entered, his face was different, not with the explosive anger of someone who had just been betrayed, but with the silent hardness of someone who had made a decision before even sitting down. He asked Dorinya to sit down. He remained standing. "You entered an employee's room in this house, went through her belongings, and used personal information as a threat," he said, in a low and absolutely firm voice. "I want your suitcases at the door within 1 hour." Dorinya tried to speak. He raised his hand. 1 hour. After that, he turned to Renata. And said, with a simplicity that needed no ornament at all, "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this." Renata felt her eyes burn. Not from sadness. From something she had forgotten what it felt like, to be defended. Dorinya left with her suitcases at the appointed time. There was no scene. No dramatic crying or farewell speech. She crossed the mansion's entrance with the stiffness of someone swallowing humiliation without chewing it, got into the car she had called, and left without looking back. The door closed with a dry, final sound, and the house immediately felt lighter. In that way you only notice when a weight disappears and the air itself seems different. Valentina was sitting on the last step of the staircase, her chin resting on her hands, watching everything. When the car drove through the gate, she let out a deep breath, not out of relief, but like someone finally able to breathe at her own pace. Renata was standing by the living room window. Teodoro came over and stood beside her, the two of them looking out at the garden without saying anything for a moment. There was something comfortable in that silence that was different from all the other silences they had shared before. This one didn't need to be filled. "Are you going to stay?" he asked, without looking at her. "I don't know if my place here still makes sense," Renata answered honestly. He then turned to her. And for the first time since she had entered that house, Teodoro looked at her without haste, without distance, without that protective layer very wounded men build around themselves. Renata. His voice came out different, lower. Your place here was never what I pretended it was. She didn't answer immediately. But she didn't look away either. In the days that followed, things changed without anyone needing to name what was changing. Teodoro began arriving earlier for dinner. Valentina started sitting at the table with the two of them without being called. Conversations that used to last 5 minutes started lasting 1 hour, 2 hours, with the sound of voices blending with the clinking of silverware and the smell of food, filling the kitchen in a way it hadn't been filled in a very long time. One night, after Valentina went upstairs to sleep, Teodoro stood up from the table and walked into the hallway. He stopped in front of the locked door at the end of the upper floor, the same door Renata had watched him stand before so many times without understanding. This time, he opened it. He turned to her, standing at the entrance of the hallway unsure whether she should follow, and said, "You can come in." It was Luisa's room. His wife's. It was exactly as it had been left, not like a tidy untouched shrine, but like a room that had belonged to a real person. A stack of books on the bedside table. A scarf folded over a chair. A photograph in a simple frame on the dresser, showing the three of them, Teodoro, Luisa, and a young Valentina with her hair tied back, laughing at something outside the frame. Renata looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked joyful, she said softly. She was, Teodoro answered. And she would have liked you. I know that for certain. Renata felt those words settle inside her in a way she hadn't expected. Not as permission, she didn't need anyone's permission, but as something gentler. Like recognition. Teodoro closed the bedroom door that night with a calmness even he seemed to notice. As if closing that door this time was different from every other time. Not abandonment, not forgetting, but a way of continuing to carry what he had loved without letting that weight stop him from moving forward. It was weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon with the garden full of light, that he proposed. He hadn't planned an elaborate setting. There were no scattered flowers or special dinner. The three of them were on the porch, Teodoro, Renata, and Valentina, with plates of fruit in the middle of the table and an open book Renata had set aside to listen to Valentina tell some story about school. And in the middle of the conversation, without any calculated transition, Teodoro took a small box from his pocket and placed it on the table with the naturalness of someone setting down a glass of water. Renata looked at the box. Looked at him. "You are the most dignified person who has ever entered this house," he said. "And I don't want to pretend anymore that what I feel is something else. Put on a wedding dress and marry me." Valentina stopped speaking halfway through her sentence. She became absolutely still, her eyes moving from one to the other, waiting. Renata looked at the little box, at him, at Valentina, at the light-filled garden. She thought about the school hallway where she had found the girl sitting on the floor. She thought about the kitchen at 11 at night with Drummond open on the table. She thought about the 8 months of invisibility that, without her realizing it, had also been 8 months of rebuilding. "Yes," she said. Just like that. Valentina made a sound that was half scream, half laughter, and hugged both of them at the same time with that clumsy teenage strength that still doesn't know the right measure for big emotions. The ring was simple. A small stone, without excess. But when Renata slipped it onto her finger, she felt the right weight of it. Not the weight of an achievement, but the weight of something that had arrived through the proper door. Through preserved dignity, through love built slowly, through the mistake she had made finally becoming smaller than the woman she had chosen to be afterward. The ceremony was small. Only people who truly mattered. And when the engagement became marriage, months later, what remained was not the party or the dress or the flower-filled garden. What remained was that image, Teodoro holding Renata's hand, and Valentina between them, her face turned upward and that smile that had been hidden away for far too long finally back where it had always belonged. No one in that house needed to pretend anymore that they were okay. Because they were. And sometimes that's all it takes. One person who stays when they could have left, who listens when everyone else fell silent, who sees dignity where the world saw only downfall, to rebuild what seemed beyond repair. Renata had not been searching for love. She had been searching for a new beginning. And she discovered that when we stop hiding from our own worth, what we deserve finds its way to us. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us here in the comments what you thought, and which city or country you're watching from. It means a lot.